Okay, so this is probably the last lecture and try to wrap up the last 40 years or so of history in a nutshell. The things get started off after 1968 with Richard Nixon, and Nixon's a interesting president. I mean, obviously, um, the Watergate scandal like weighs heavily on his legacy. Um, there is a greater attention towards interference when it comes to the Cold War, in particular, um, Vietnamization in the war in Vietnam that spills over to places like Laos and Cambodia, and has the effect of creating chaos in Cambodia. Um, but on the flip side, you see him as this person willing to go to China and meet with leadership there and reestablish ties with China, which has developed ever since. I mean, it's probably one of the greatest, most crucial moments in recent history that's affected us even today, depending on global economy. This had an effect of leading to some of the really first concrete treaties over um, weapons. This is the SALT treaties between the United States and Soviet Union. So, for much as he's I guess you call quote unquote anti-communist hawk, especially with the removal of Salvador Allende in Chile and establishment of Pinochet coup there. At the same time, he's somebody who is willing to get to work with communist states. His legislation, for he runs as the silent majority candidate. He does his 68, and a lot is made up from this, the fact that he is, running as law and order candidate as kind of this guy who's there to appeal to kind of like the non-activist American public that are just kind of over, the 60s, I guess. On the other hand, his legislation is it's not progressive. Silent Spring had come out, and so everybody was all about all of a sudden paying attention to the environment. And so, with during his presidency, that TEPA signed, Environmental Protection Agency, among a number of environmental laws. Um, Also, even the Title IX clause law that we know about and very important even for like the workplace and school. That's something with Nixon. So Nixon's actually, you think about conservatism, modern day conservatism, which is born out of the failed '64 election of Barry Goldwater. Nixon is somebody who doesn't fit comfortably in that camp, and frankly, his removal, his self removal from presidency after the Watergate scandal. Um, President Gerald Ford becomes president, is not reelected. Instead, it's the outsider Jimmy Carter. That's kind of the last time you have what you would call a non-conservative Republican president in office. So more on that in a second. And with Carter, because of the really general overview, Carter is an outsider from Georgia, governor there. Kind of a clean cut image he's projecting. The U.S. is out of Vietnam now after 75. And again, his foreign policy, the good side of it is the Camp David meetings where Egypt and Israel are going to sign a treaty. The, I guess you could say, terrible aspect of his foreign policy is the Iran Revolution and his kind of tone deafness in taking in the Shah, which leads to the takeover of the U.S. embassy in Iran, capture of Americans there until his removal. His when he leaves office, those prisoners are allowed to go back home to the U.S. So there is it's not something to write home about. Let's just put it that way. It is the world is kind of in some way you can say things seem to be on the up and up, even with regards to the Soviet Union and China um, during the Nixon years, and then with the Soviet Union invading Afghanistan, a Iranian revolution happening. It seems like the U.S. doesn't have much control. Um, and then internally, the economy really takes a dive in the late 70s, and under Carter's administration, this is the stagflation moment where um, just it's one of the more famous moments where the U.S. economy is in deep trouble, and this is going to lead to some of the policies of any election of Ronald Reagan. So with Reagan comes the conservative revolution. Reagan is an important figure for that. Uh, and so when you think about conservative politics, this is kind of rises with Reagan. Um, Reagan is when it comes to culture, there's a big push back against kind of the edginess of the 1980s and 1970s. You think about films and things like that. You think more of like what we assume is like the pop culture of the United States, with some of the movies and cartoons and whatnot that are starting to come on the rise. I think like the Star Wars films, the Indiana Jones films, Transformers cartoons. So uh, kind of corresponds with just the whole like Reagan time period. Um, Again, he's mostly famous for pushing this hard line with communism and then kind of turning it around, which I'll talk about in a second. Um, the crisis of HIV and AIDS is big in the 80s, as also the attention to the war on drugs. Even though in one case you could say the fight against AIDS has obviously gotten better in the United States. There's a lot of ignorance at this time period about like what the heck it was. Um, but the war on drugs, that's something that you can argue. The attention's there. I wonder how well the government's doing in curbing, um, drug trafficking and the high rate of people, taking narcotics. Economics, he's famous for tax cuts, the supply side economics, or also famously known as trickle down economics. So give big tax cuts. That means you're not taxing people especially on the top level enough, and you're hoping the money trickles down through private industry. So when you talk about conservatism, it's more of attention towards private industry, the job market, the capitalist market, and not these like big government plans like the Johnson's Great Society or FDR's Roosevelt's New Deal. Reagan sees a lot of government waste when it comes to that, and so he wants to put money into the market basically. Ties in with Takaki to some extent is when you talk about immigration. Um, 1967 had the big immigration law where you see immigration really open up to outside of Europe finally, especially towards Asia. Some would say that's a lot to do with the Cold War, trying to win the ideological war, especially because with Vietnam, it's kind of a hot spot. Um, and whereas with the IRCA, you have a lot of people who were undocumented be put on the path for, um, you know, become legal citizens. This is the last concrete time a law like that happened. In fact, you're going to see as you move into the 90s, things are going to get really rough. So before we talk about that, the other thing that Reagan's famous for is him and his vice president, George H.W. Bush, who will be president after Reagan, which shows you Reagan's popularity. They'll oversee um, the kind of last stand of the Cold War. Um, The invasion of Afghanistan for the Soviet Union was disastrous. It's Soviet Union's Vietnam. Um, I'll skip that. Reagan famously visits with the new leader of Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, this younger, more open-minded guy. And again, it's kind of a shift from Reagan's hardline in the earlier years of the his administration or his first term. Um, all this to say that by the late '80s, after Reagan is out and Bush is president, you have the fall of the Berlin Wall in Germany. You have the first Gulf War against Saddam Hussein and his invasion of Kuwait by the United Nations, mostly led by the U.S. And then in the early '90s, the Soviet Union crumbles. And so now you're living in an age where the United States is a clear superpower of the world. Um, this then leads to the election of a Democrat, Bill Clinton, governor of Arkansas. And this is a time period where I was trying to say a second ago, after this what people would call amnesty law that happened in the late '80s under Reagan, you have this turn towards anti-immigration, especially anti-undocumented. Frankly, it starts in California with the um, certain propositions here. Clinton is elected because Americans generally want somebody who's going to deal with domestic policies now that the Cold War is over and not worried about defense anymore. Even though there is language that Americans should be paying attention to the Middle East, um, and you see this with Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations theory. Um, Clinton is big. In some ways, Clinton is a true first like neoliberal president. Is somebody who is should be pushing for progressive liberal legislation, but I mean he's the one who pushed through things like NAFTA, which was Bush's idea in the first place. Then welfare reform, which some would say is proved to be a big problem as time goes on. Um, and then obviously his liaison with Monica Lewinsky, one of his interns, leads to a lot of focus on his problem of cheating on his wife, Hillary Clinton, a number of times, at least in their past, and this gets exposed. So this is a kind of a wacky time in the 1990s. But it's also the age where computers are really taking over the markets. People have money. Racial tensions are again, on the scene with the Rodney King riots here in LA, and even the O.J. Simpson trial a few years later. So the ADA is also passed. So in the realm of like um, legislation towards disabilities, this is a big thing. That's 1990. That's not too long ago. All right. So moving past that, you think about our last 20, 30 years, um, you kind of see this general trend happen. Presidents, whether Democrat or Republican, tend to take, kind of a middle of the road when it comes to legislation. And it kind of bucks a trend. You see Nixon and Reagan are people who are, pushing progressive laws to some extent. And you see people like Obama and Clinton in particular, push for more, we would call more moderate legislation, tough legislation on like crime and things like that. Uh, Now, George W. Bush, there's a controversial election in 2000, takes office, and immediately, 9/11 happens. That then leads into the creation of the Department of Homeland Security. It also leads into two wars, the invasion of Afghanistan 2001 and invasion of Iraq 2003, which is kind of Persian Gulf War number two. It does lead to the removal of Saddam Hussein. But as we all know, we are still kind of wrapped up, and I say we, the United States, is still wrapped up in both these conflicts. Uh, the big market crash hits 2008. It's the election of President Barack Obama, and that's a big deal. Here you have a first African American president. But in the realm of legislation, a lot of it is still kind of in process. This is really going to take in. And where is DACA? Where is marriage equality? That's kind of here to stay, but what the others?